This is as much of a controversy in a sheath as it is a knife. And I'm going to go on about that. So there's going to be quite a lot of talking before we get to modifying and slicing things up. Right, in the very early 1980s, a man called Bob Lum invented essentially this blade shape, although it was more likely to be this blade shape. This is just a cheap copy of a early cold steel Tanto. I bought it off AliExpress to see if I like the idea. And it became the Americanized or westernized Tanto because it's got this chisel point as opposed to the normal Tanto that has a nice roundy point. There are some Japanese swords, and I don't know the name, I'm very sorry for everybody who's a Japanese sword expert, I'm really not, that do have this kind of chisel point, but they just don't appear in the Tanto. The Tanto is essentially the same as the sax is to the Saxons and Vikings. It is a working knife. It's much, the last thing it is a weapon. So, probably this design with these angles and so on it was, as I said, made in the 1980s by Bob Lum. Now, a fellow called Lynn Thompson, who works for Cold Steel, pops up, buys one of these off Bob Lum and says, that's quite nice. Goes back to Cold Steel in Japan and says, why don't we start making something like this? The angles are slightly different, but the point is pretty much the same. And Cold Steel say, yeah, go for it. By the early 80s, they were producing quite a line of different Tantos, and this is pretty much the latest one. This is the GI Tanto. Both Bob Lum and Lynn Thompson, indeed, are quite controversial figures if you read Blade Forum. People get quite heated about this, whether Cold Steel just stole the idea, which, from the evidence I've seen, looks pretty much what happened. Lynn Thompson apparently was responsible for a lot of the crap that's talked about these knives, Tantos in particular, that this is an armour-piercing tip. Well, on the original Tanto, it was armour-piercing if that armour was painted bamboo, so not really armour-piercing as we would understand it nowadays. There's all this rubbish as well about, these kind of blades being able to chop through machine gun barrels and samurai swords. It stems basically from the kind of hyperbole and crap, from what I understand, that came about with this knife's inception. But what a knife it is. I bought one of these cheap off Heine Haynes in the UK, and I pulled the trigger on it really to see what the fuss was about, and because it was cheap. Very much, and I still can't understand why. In the US, it's seen very much as a survival type knife. Yeah, I mean, my best friend who died in some fairly odd circumstances did use a Tanto as his bushcraft knife, and he loved it. This is a big, thick knife. It's ruler even, 30 odd centimetres, so just over 12 inches. Blade is funny, and it gets kind of criticised. I thought this was fairly obvious what this bit. It turns it almost immediately into a sub-hilt fighter, I can see, and much more as a fighting knife than a traditional Tanto would have been realistically. Yeah, it gets a nice grip. The handles are often said to be a bit slippery. Well, keep watching because I'm going to do something about that. And in fact, I'm going to do something about the whole thing. And yeah, I mean, it's got this, you can't quite see this, what looks like a crackle coat finish. It's not, it's just really badly applied paint. Some of the earlier ones had this sort of painting on, actually engraved, and there are 10 or 12 how to customize your Tanto videos on YouTube. Some of them are really, really nice. One of them actually shows this blade with this coating stripped off, and it's gorgeous. And I think this is the point really about knives, cheaper knives like this. Buy one. There's no point in trying to keep this one standard because there's millions and millions and millions. So buy one, have a go at whatever you like really, because it's a beater knife. It's quite a nicely designed beater, but it's a beater all the same. We will now hopefully go out and see what we can do with it. So, what can it do? Actually, the grip on these isn't quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. Right, bag of flour. That's opened. Now, did we say it was armour piercing against bamboo? Yeah, definitely. What about armour piercing against a tin? You'll notice it's already got a hole in from when I did this earlier, but the camera froze, unfortunately. So you can guess the answer, really, can't you? Let's try it again, though. Armour piercing, and there's nothing on the tip. It's taken a little bit of paint off there. That's not bad. And last, what can they do against a slash-proof glove? Let's fingers. Well, here's a tip. If you want some slash-proof gloves, don't buy the cheap ones off eBay. They're not very good. They're certainly not Tanto-proof. Yeah, that was fun. With a little bit of skill and a few facilities, not much, my workshop is essentially a bench in the garden, you can actually make something quite special out of one of these knives. I forgot to discuss the sheath. If you undo these two bolts here, you can move it up and down. You can flip it over and have a left-handed sheath as well. I polished these rings up with a bit of glass paper, polished the screws, found out they were brass because I didn't know whether to use brass or stainless, so I went for brass because I had some basically, and polished that stud up there. Makes a really nice sheath. The knife added an extra hole in the blade which needed a carbide tipped drill bit, and about 45 minutes. It wasn't a quick job, nor was opening up that hole either. And used these brass screw fixings on there, bit of brass tube through there. Tried a bit of jimping, which didn't go too well, but it makes that sub-hilt bit actually feel like a trigger. It's a really nice feeling. Tried a bit of jimping on the cross guard, and the best bit as far as I'm concerned was a bit of file work that I put on the tang. And it took a couple of hours and a lot of concentrating to do, but there's some very, very simple videos on YouTube about how to do it, and I would just recommend buying a cheap knife and seeing what you can make out of it, because you can make something, I think, really quite different. The workmanship could have been a bit better on that jimping. I'm not very happy with that, but I've subsequently bought a proper Dremel and unfortunately chipped there. Added these stippling effect to go boring, and it now means as well, given this is slightly raised, it's massively improved the grip of the thing. People often complain about the grips on these not being very good. Well, they are now. So yeah, I'm really, really pleased with the way this has turned out, and I'm gonna get to love a Tanto, I think.